America's biopharmaceutical companies have one very important thing in common:
a common enemy.
We're making great progress because we're collaborating in ways that we've never done before.
In a matter of weeks, we've progressed from potential treatments
to antibodies and antivirals that have shown positive results.
to several promising vaccine candidates.
Because science
is how we get back to normal.
Ensuring Florida is the healthiest state in the nation requires research and development for a COVID-19 vaccine and for citizens across the world impacted by this pandemic. Please welcome Lori Reilly, COO of PhRMA, and a dynamic panel of the country's leading biopharmaceutical researchers on the future of a vaccine. Thank you to PhRMA for your generous support of the Future of Florida Forum.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the Florida Chamber of Commerce for having us all here today. Before we get started with the panel, let me briefly introduce who's joining me today. First, we have Dr. Richard Nettles, who is Vice President, Medical Affairs for Janssen Infectious Diseases. Cathy Mayfield, who is founder of the Lawson Mayfield Memorial Foundation, is joining us. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Freda-Lewis Hall, who is former Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President for Pfizer. Before I get into the discussion with our panelists, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about what the biopharmaceutical industry has been doing over the last many months as it relates to COVID-19. Over the last 6 months, our industry has literally been working around the clock to combat this virus in a couple of different ways. First, we are working in conjunction with other life sciences companies to help develop new diagnostics to test for the virus, which we all know is very important. Second, we have been working to tackle the virus by finding effective treatments and vaccines. In total today, there are more than 1,500 COVID-19 clinical trials, including over 80 that are taking place here in Florida. These clinical trials include several different types of vaccines that many of you have probably heard and read about that are now, some of them in phase 3 of clinical trials. And we have over 200 of our company's products that are being tested as part of these different trials to ensure that those are both safe and effective. We're also developing new treatments and therapies for those infected with the virus, but we know that the challenges in getting to a treatment or a vaccine can be difficult. First of all, the immune system is quite complex, so it's imperative that we have a lot of shots on goal and a lot of different companies trying to bring either a vaccine or a therapeutic to market. We're adapting to new information as we learn it also. We've learned about different medicines that exist in the marketplace today that have been tested, but companies are also trying to find new medicines entirely to bring to market. We know the times that we're in are quite extraordinary, but our industry is making great progress in tackling what one would consider the greatest healthcare challenge of our time. And we've done it quickly and safely as possible. Many have asked, how are we able to respond so quickly to this global pandemic? And I think there are a couple of reasons why the industry has been able to engage so quickly and so effectively. The first reason is we've had years of deep scientific knowledge that we've gained from looking at similar viruses, many of which you've probably heard of in the past, diseases like MERS and SARS, influenza, HIV, and hepatitis C. Second, the industry has invested over decades of time into new technologies that have helped us shorten the amount of time it took to decode the virus and also hopefully develop a new vaccine. And third, companies have the ability to manufacture at scale and then disseminate those vaccines and treatments to patients. This time has led to an unparalleled level of collaboration that exists today in the marketplace. While our companies are traditionally competitors in the market, they share a common goal as it relates to COVID-19, and that is beating this virus. Partnerships that in the past would have taken months to plan and formalize are now coming together in the matter of weeks. Just one example, 2 of our member companies have partnered to develop a potential vaccine through shared resources, research, and technology. Companies are also working together about manufacturing capacity so that when we do have an effective vaccine, we're able to scale up and produce the level necessary to fight this disease. And we're seeing collaborations happen between big companies and smaller biotech companies who may have certain expertise that we lack. We're also seeing companies share clinical trial protocols so that researchers understand what others are doing. And we're sharing clinical trial data with companies to understand the successes and failures of trials, which will hopefully help inform the next round of clinical trials. This robust collaboration between our companies is not just limited within the biopharmaceutical industry. We are also collaborating with government entities like the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, and others. We have worked, for example, with the FDA Commissioner in an ongoing dialogue on regulatory priorities to speed the development of a safe and effective vaccine and therapeutic. We've got a number of partnerships, and again, while our companies are working quickly, we recognize that producing and manufacturing a safe and effective vaccine is really paramount. Top of mind to so many people, in addition to getting a medicine approved safely and effectively, is price and affordability. We know that for many people, they are nervous about their ability to access and afford a therapy or a vaccine. And I want to assure you that we are working with governments and payers to ensure that when new treatments or vaccines for COVID-19 are approved, that they will be affordable and available for patients that need them. Companies have a strong track record of pricing responsibly during pandemics, and we don't expect affordability will be a problem at this time. I'm very pleased again to welcome the tremendous panel that we have here today, and I would like to kick off our discussion starting with Dr. Nettles and a question for him. Dr. Nettles, we know that time is of the essence in the search of a COVID-19 vaccine, and many companies like yours are working quickly to bring such a vaccine to market. Can you talk a little bit about how Janssen, is expediting this process while also maintaining safety and efficacy?
Absolutely, Lori. Thank you very much for inviting J&J and Janssen to be here, part of the panel. And I'm going to echo a lot of the comments that you just said, but I'll speak specifically about what J&J is doing during this time frame. So we started with a multi-pronged approach in January this year, as soon as the genetic code for the coronavirus was released. And of utmost importance, as part of this approach to deal with the coronavirus, was the development of a vaccine. And we're leveraging AdVac technology, which we've been using to develop vaccines for other serious infectious diseases like Ebola, HIV, RSV. And we're doing that because we know a lot about the track record and the safety of this vaccine. So we've used this technology in over 100,000 individuals. That really allowed us to take a jump start with the development of a vaccine against coronavirus. Secondly, I would say it was the partnerships that we've put in place over the past several months. We're working very closely with BARDA, NIAID, the FDA, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, just to name a few, to allow us to bring forward the best minds to develop this vaccine as fast as possible. And the good news is that earlier this month, we were able to move that vaccine candidate into phase 3 development. It's a very large phase 3 clinical trial with over 60,000 individuals participating in the trial. We have sites on 3 different continents, including here in the US, but also in South Africa and 6 countries in South America. If that phase 3 trial would be successful and show that we have a safe and effective vaccine, that could potentially allow us to speak with the FDA about emergency authorization of our vaccine in the first quarter of 2021. Now, obviously, that decision would be in the hands of the FDA, so they would need to make that declaration. In parallel with the clinical research, we've also been scaling up our manufacturing capacity. So typically in a vaccine development program, you would wait until you're absolutely sure that you're going to have success coming out of that phase 3 trial until you would scale up your manufacturing process. And really that's one of the important ways we've accelerated the development this year, is to do that scale up of manufacturing in parallel rather than in a serial manner, with the clinical development program. But I also want to echo one of the most important things you said. This vaccine needs to be safe, and we guarantee that we will not cut any corners in developing this vaccine. So as an example, I gave you the phase 3 clinical trial is a very large trial. We're not moving forward with small trials, 60,000 individuals in that trial. And we recognize that it's so important that we not put forward a vaccine that is either questions around the safety or the efficacy. We've recently signed a pledge with other manufacturers stating that we won't put forward to the FDA for consideration of a vaccine until we feel comfortable that we've met a very high bar with regard to the safety and the efficacy of this vaccine, because we feel ethically that's the right thing to do. So those are some of the examples about how we've moved forward this past year, really with urgency.
Thank you, Dr. Nettles. And so much of what you said was so important. I think the comment you made in particular about the fact that companies like J&J are performing tasks that normally would happen sequentially, that you're doing them concurrently, including things like manufacturing at risk. So J&J, before they know whether or not their vaccine will be successful, like other companies, are producing them so that they will be ready in the hopes that that vaccine does get approved. So I thought that was a really important point, as well as the point you made about the pledge, which was really unprecedented. I think 9 of the vaccine manufacturers coming together and really reiterating to the American public our commitment to ensuring safety and efficacy before we will even seek FDA approval for a product. So thank you very much. I want to shift for a minute to Cathy. Cathy, you are especially close to the issue of vaccines and their importance in our society. Do you mind sharing a little bit about where that passion for this issue comes from?
I would love to, Lori, and I so appreciate y'all including me in this distinguished panel. In 2009, 11 years ago last week, we lost our 18-year-old daughter, Lawson, to bacterial meningitis. And we were dealing with our grief and our nightmare and everything else of losing our vibrant, super healthy 18-year-old. We wanted to try to find something positive to do with our problem, with our grief. So I started researching things about bacterial meningitis and just was amazed at how little I honestly knew about vaccine-preventable diseases, about vaccines in general. Lawson had had all the required vaccinations all through her childhood and her life. So I was absolutely astonished to know that there were so many vaccine-preventable diseases out there that are still occurring. So she literally came home from traveling in Europe. There again, 18-year-old, super healthy. She was an equestrian. She came home on a Sunday evening. She rode 5 horses the next day and was complaining about a headache late that afternoon. And I thought, well, she's had migraines before when we were competing, when she was exhausted, exams, all that kind of thing. So I said, she's probably dehydrated. She's traveling from Germany the day before. I didn't think a lot about it. That late that afternoon, 5 o'clock or so, she left an appointment with me and went home and went to bed, which is highly irregular. Went up to check on her about 6. She was very sensitive to light, no fever, very sensitive to light, had a horrific headache. And I thought, this is really unusual. Nauseated, really didn't want to move. So I gave it about another hour, there again, just convinced it was a migraine, and went back up and I said, I think we need to go to the hospital. She didn't even talk about it. She didn't say, no way, I'm not going. So we rushed to the hospital, and then our nightmare really began. She was diagnosed with bacterial meningitis like 1 o'clock in the morning, had some real very, very serious seizures about 6 a.m., was in ICU after that, came back as positive for bacterial meningitis. And we lost her literally 3 days later. And I think she never regained consciousness. I think one of the most amazing things to me was the whole time the doctors were telling me in the emergency room at 1 o'clock in the morning, all the different things about bacterial meningitis, what the side effects could be, that death was a possibility, I thought, she's so healthy. There's absolutely no way that she is so healthy, and that I always associated bacterial meningitis with babies. Well, in channeling our grief and all the information we learned about there's some incredibly wonderful organizations out there to help people with information about bacterial meningitis. I found that that's not the case, that although it's rare, there are still plenty of horrible things that happen: death, side effects, deafness, blindness, limb amputation, horrible, horrible things that many times are vaccine preventable. So we have taken our initiative, we started a run. We've had 9 years so far of a very successful community-oriented run, just trying to advocate for bacterial meningitis, trying to get students aware, particularly high school students, maybe incoming freshmen of colleges, because that's an age that's more vulnerable to this disease. There again, the whole vaccination is the vaccination process is so important and so extremely important in today's environment where we see everything going on with COVID. So that's how we became involved. I am just a very passionate advocate for vaccines of all kinds, and just am so appreciative of being involved in this panel, and so amazed at the incredible work you are all doing.
Well, Cathy, thank you for sharing what I can only imagine is every parent's worst nightmare. Having an 18-year-old daughter myself, and trying to put myself in your shoes is almost incomprehensible. So thank you for turning what is probably the very worst moment in your life into something positive in terms of vaccine education. It is much appreciated. Dr. Lewis Hall, we've talked a little bit about the importance of ensuring that a vaccine is safe. And we also have learned a lot through our COVID experience about how COVID has hit certain communities, particularly minority communities, harder than others. Can you talk a little bit about how we can gain trust from important communities in our fight against COVID to ensure that they trust our industry and trust the safety and efficacy of a vaccine that hopefully we will have soon?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me with you today. This is such an important topic, especially important because however elegant our science is, and however rigorous the work that we do is, unless the American people have confidence that the vaccines are safe and effective, they will not have the optimum impact. And so making sure that communities understand and are bought into this and have confidence in the safety and efficacy of the vaccines is really critical. The first thing I think is important is transparency. Mm-hmm. Most people don't know what it takes to design a vaccine, to test a vaccine, to review it, to monitor it, to approve it. All of these things, most people don't know why should they have to know that? But the transparency in the rigorous nature of the process that each and every step entails, and the commitment of the organizations, the institutions, and the individuals that are charged with responsibility in each step of this process, I think are important for people to see. I was having the conversation with a friend of mine who said it's kind of like the restaurants that have the kitchens open. Some people want to see what's going on back there and understand every detail, and that makes them more confident. Some people are inspired by the fact that you would even let them look back there, and others are like, no, I'm fine, just bring it out. And I think we're experiencing that now. So transparency, I think, is key. We got to figure out a way to do that. And communication and partnership is key. Mm-hmm. There, as you mentioned, there are some communities that have had especially trying historical relationships with the healthcare system. Yeah. Blacks and Native Americans are a great example, and as it turns out, are disproportionately affected by COVID. And so the question becomes, how do we create a relationship with a community that is a trusting one? And what we hear is this. First of all, listen. Please hear what our concerns are, what our questions are, how we are going to receive the information, whatever community we're from. Second is we may not have the expertise that the healthcare system has, but we have our own expertise and insights. We need those listened to and tapped into and valued. And between the transparency, the communication, and the honest partnerships, the trusted partnerships in the community, I think that will make meaningful progress in having people have confidence in the rigorous, tried and true processes that we have around the development and the deployment of vaccines.
Thank you so much. And I think the points you made there, to your point, extend far beyond COVID-19, right? It's about rebuilding trust and transparency with communities that extends beyond the current pandemic we're in. And I am personally thankful for the work that you are doing to help our organization, our industry, make some of those important improvements that need to happen. Dr. Nettles, I mentioned earlier that Florida is a key state in our COVID-19 research. There's over 80 clinical trials that are happening in Florida now. It's also a key component of Operation Warp Speed, which is our kind of national effort to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and distribution of COVID-19, hopefully by 2021, the vaccine. What are you doing at Janssen to ensure that we get a diverse pool of participants in a clinical trial? We heard Dr. Freda-Lewis Hall talk about the importance of rebuilding trust in certain communities. We recognize that certain minority communities have been hit particularly hard, and we need to ensure that they can participate in trials so that we know that when we get an approved vaccine that it will work in all different types of diverse populations. So how are you approaching that issue at Janssen?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to reiterate a number of the points that Dr. Lewis Hall mentioned. So I completely agree with her answer. You know, at Janssen, I think the work really started with, we have an internal team that focuses on diversity in clinical trial. And they had a number of tasks that they needed to do over the last year. The first is starting with internal culture. So we need to recognize internally at large pharmaceutical companies like Janssen and J&J the importance of making sure that when we conduct a clinical trial that we have adequate representation of the entire population that might end up using the drug or the vaccine in this case. The second is understanding the nature of access. And I say that in a couple of different ways. So selecting the sites where you conduct your clinical trials is very important. And then just the logistical aspects of access. So if you select sites which people have to drive to, you may end up then have created a barrier for someone who would need to take public transportation, for instance. So understanding really from the highest level when you're selecting the sites down to the granular level of what's it going to take for someone to actually show up at one of those sites and participate in a clinical trial. And the last piece that Dr. Lewis Hall started with is transparency and trust. Mm-hmm. And particularly during this COVID pandemic, I think that's going to be critically important. We need to feel like we can understand and believe when people are talking with us. And so one of the things that we've done with the COVID vaccine trials, we've published the entire protocol for our phase 3 trial that's called Ensemble on the internet in a completely unredacted way. This is something that's very unusual for pharmaceutical companies to do. They like to keep those protocols under lock and key because there's some confidential information in there. But in this instance, putting it out so that everybody can read it, we hope with regard to building transparency into the process will help individuals feel comfortable. Just as you said, the communities that are being most severely impacted in the U.S., African American community, Hispanic Latinx community, and the Native American communities are those that we need to be sure that are included in our clinical trials, so that at the end of the day, when we have results, anyone can look at those results and say, here's how someone who looks like me, who is of the same culture, ethnical background, this is how they did, and the vaccine was shown to work and be safe in somebody who's like me. So that's what we aspire to do, and those are some of the ways that we hope to make sure we have diversity in our clinical trial.
That's great. Cathy, going back to you for a minute, I know you and through your foundation and the partners that you work with have been closely monitoring falling rates of recommended vaccinations for children. How can we best work with policymakers so that we don't encounter another pandemic or outbreak of some of, as you mentioned before, some of the preventable infectious diseases that we know exist today?
Well, Lori, that's a really good point. It's frightening, some of the statistics we found through the Florida Department of Health this year. In April of this year versus April of 2019, we had a 40% drop in the kids getting vaccinations, the normal vaccination rates. I'm sure a ton of it was due to the fact that schools were out of, that we were not in school and everyone's frightened to go to the doctor. There's so much out there that this could be really, really problematic from the standpoint of our herd immunity and what would happen with people that cannot get vaccinations and therefore are protected by the people that do. So we also, speaking to what all our other panel members have said about transparency, we've got to be able to trust our scientists to know that these vaccines are safe and they're preventable. They're going to prevent these diseases. They're going to do what they say they're going to do. So we've got to build that trust again. So we are working as hard as we can to reach out to people, we will reach out legislatively, we will reach out as far as the school systems and try to get the information out there. Florida, as a matter of fact, still doesn't have a requirement for college-age students coming into schools to have a meningitis vaccination. We would love to see that as a requirement. It's frightening that we don't have that. So that's just one example, and when we're in the middle of this COVID situation trying to develop a vaccination, it just brings it all front and center. So we just really are going to have to work harder than ever. At the same time, it gets us all motivated, very motivated, so I'm hoping that we'll see some really good things coming out of this next year.
Cathy, thank you so much for the work you and your partners are doing along these lines. And whether it's vaccinations or people not going in for preventative services, I think we're going to see the repercussions that COVID has happened for many years to come, unfortunately. Dr. Lewis Hall, can you talk a little bit? You've sat in chairs within our industry for many years. Can you speak in terms of how you believe our industry is best positioned to find a vaccine?
So I am so proud, actually, of what the industry has shown itself to be able to do under these circumstances. And I think that there are probably 4 things that really drive this. The first is having built an incredible scientific foundation that we have now become willing to share with one another. New technologies, building on a history of successful vaccine development in the past, pulling all of that together and advancing this work. The second you mentioned earlier, which is the collaboration, unprecedented between academic centers and companies, small companies and large companies, you name it, we have come together as small groups and large groups, and this collaboration has really turbocharged our ability to move forward. And it's taken many forms. Some of it is a collaboration to share resources. Others are data sharing platforms. We've built community or master protocols, if you would. Thank you, Dr. Nettles, for talking about having shared your complete protocol to make sure that we don't have to reinvent the wheel with each of the vaccines that comes into development. The other is process innovation, which I think is really fascinating. I don't doubt that we have learned some things that we're going to apply in the future in the work that we're doing now on taking things from moving from one step and then giving ourselves some time to build the clinical trial site selection and training, all the things that go on. We pulled that forward and started doing things in parallel, which again is a new way of advancing the way in which we move therapeutic innovation and vaccines forward. And then last but not least, I do believe that we're building quite incredible partnerships now with communities. We're tapping into partnerships that perhaps are a little non-traditional with community organizations, with academic institutions in different ways. And so I think that all of these things together as innovations in the way that we think, in the culture that we practice in, and the way that we work together are inspiring and are the things that are the wind at our back, if you would, to get vaccines into the community to help us fight this pandemic.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hall, and for all of the panelists here today. Let me just offer a few closing remarks, picking up on a lot of what we've talked about here today. The good news is that our companies have been able and willing to take what some might consider to be large gambles due to a policy environment that exists and has existed in the US that has rewarded companies to take risks and allowed companies to recoup investments that they've made. But that's always potentially in jeopardy if the policy environment changes and companies are living under a different set of rules that either limit how much they can recoup. It can become harder to be able to go all in the way that companies today have done so in the search for a COVID vaccine. Our belief is that we need to protect innovation, not try and undermine it. We've had a highly successful ecosystem in the US that has allowed our industry not just to work with each other, but to work with government and academia in the search for cures and new innovative treatments for patients. And we need to look at policies that will continue to allow that, but also ensure that patients can access and afford the therapies we need. We recognize that no medicine is worth anything if patients can't access and afford it. So we are supportive of reforms that are in the best interests of Americans that would lower their costs, ensure they get access to the medicines and hopefully vaccines to treat conditions like COVID, but also that allow companies to continue to innovate and respond to situations like the COVID-19 pandemic. We're committed to bringing hopefully therapies and vaccines to market. We want to thank the Florida Chamber of Commerce for allowing us some time today. And again, I want to thank all of the panelists that we had today for the wonderful conversation, and good luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
While you do your part to beat coronavirus, America's biopharmaceutical companies are working around the clock to do ours. Testing existing medicines, developing new treatments and vaccines, and collaborating with the FDA, NIH, and CDC. We're working with doctors and hospitals on over 235 clinical trials and ramping up production capabilities to ensure these medicines are available. Because science is how we get back to normal.